A year ago today, Jews were raped, kidnapped, and slaughtered by a terrorist organization called Hamas, or as the left likes to call them, freedom fighters or the resistance. Or, I suppose, as the Seattle Times is still calling them, militants. Not terrorists, but militants. Now, Jason, militants is not a positive word. That's true. It's not. It's not. There is a difference, though, between militants and terrorists. Yeah?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, just a little tiny bit. Those silly words with those silly definitions. And somehow, the writer on this story, David Gutman, over at the Seattle Times, he decided, or the paper decided, I don't know which made the ultimate decision, but they decided to frame the October 7th anniversary from both sides. We had to have both sides coverage of October 7th. In fact, in this story at the Seattle Times, they had as much ink that was wasted on the imaginary plight of Muslims than it did on an actual story about Jews. The third sentence of this story quotes an imam. The third sentence. And then this is how they framed the terrorist attack. 1 year ago, Hamas militants stormed into Israel, killing more than 1,200 people and kidnapping more than 240 hostages. Israel responded with a bombardment and invasion of Gaza that has killed more than 41,000 Palestinians, according to the territory's health ministry, and displaced more than 85% of Gaza's population. It's quite the framing there. Oof. Where they get that 41,000 number from? They call it the territory's health ministry? What's that?
I think it's Hamas.
Oh, okay. The terrorist organization or militants.
Yes, the same, yes.
Okay. The ones who committed the horrific act on October 7th?
Correct.
Okay. But those numbers are totally legitimate that they give.
I guess so, yeah.
Okay. It's weird that they don't point out that it's Hamas's health ministry. They just say the territory's health ministry. Okay. Almost like it's a third party that's just presenting just the facts, ma'am. It's kind of weird how that works.
Totally above board, nonpartisan.
Oh, for sure. I mean, well, they don't like the Jews. But other than that, they're very, very good with their numbers. And I just love this idea that the bombardment, Israel versus God, you mean the targeting of Hamas terrorists? Yeah, that part is true. And then it gets into a conversation about discrimination post-October 7th in the United States. In particular, obviously, it's the Seattle Times, so they talk a lot about what's happening here. And they frame the discrimination against Muslims. And then they get into anti-Semitism. You see, all of a sudden, the article switches its priority. It opened by talking about Israel, and then it started to switch. Now it's talking about the plight of Muslims, and then as a secondary story, what's going on with anti-Semitism. And it brings up the CARE Washington propaganda poll that we talked about last week. CARE is the Council on American Islamic Relations. And this is an organization that has had direct ties to Hamas. One might question whether or not it's appropriate to cite anything from CARE Washington or not. The national organization is a horrific one. You'll recall that its executive director, the national CARE, celebrated October 7th. And it got to a point that the White House had to put out a statement to condemn the anti-Semitism. Now, the White House didn't just throw around statements, especially during an election year, against the demographic that they need to win in states like Michigan. But even they had to say something. That's how bad it was. But in this made-up poll, they say that 8 in 10 Muslims Washingtonian Muslims, 8 in 10, they said in the last year they felt discriminated against. 82%, I think the official number was, 82%. Now, again, I said this last week, but the majority of the Muslim population in Washington is in King County. King County is very, 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 very far to the what?
Left.
Okay, the opposite of right.
Yes.
So the county that has had people marching on our streets chanting for the genocide of Jews and Israel not existing, the side that had a principal defending a swastika, the county and city of Seattle and Redmond, actually, I believe, has the first Muslim council member. But in the city of Seattle, that as a policy had previously sided against Israel's independence. That's the area that has 80% of Washington Muslims feeling like they're discriminated against. So the thousands of people who've been marching on our streets against Israel, they're also against Muslims?
Yeah, I don't know how they thread the needle there. But
It's odd, right? I mean, well, it's a nuanced conversation. It's very complex, which is what we're supposed to say when talking about this issue, even though it's not all that complex at all. It's actually quite easy. Terrorism bad, democracy good. Rape is not a way to go about your attacks against Israel. I know. I've turned a corner. Because before everyone was totally accepting of rape, but now people are starting to finally see, oh no one was ever in favor of rape as a means of going after your enemy, but now all of a sudden you're downplaying or ignoring it or pretending it didn't actually happen?
it was really eye-opening.
Whew. It is amazing. Now, one of the questions, I believe it was the only question, as I can recall, that they based their poll on. They had a bunch of other questions, but it was more specific about in their lifetime. But the only question I saw that was related post-October 7th was, have you felt discriminated against since October 7th? Yes or no? That was it. No saying even what the discrimination was. It didn't even have to be discriminatory. Simply holding the opinion that you felt one time like you were discriminated against on the basis of your Muslim faith. That's all that it took to get to 82%.
It was a very scientific poll.
In fairness, it was. I mean, they posted links on their CARE social media accounts and everything, almost like the only people who might follow CARE are activist folks in their camp who always like to play victim, especially when Jews are involved. So the article cites that silly story. They wrote an entire press release report on that last week, but they print it again uncritically. And then they cite an ADL poll that showed some 10,000 incidents of reported anti-Semitism in the last year, but then offers criticism of the methodology there. That's where the methodology gets called out. Not when it comes to the CARE poll. They said the methodology was changed after October 7th to include expressions of anti-Zionism that could be perceived as supporting violence. Yeah, the whole from the river to the sea is, in fact, promoting violence. The whole idea of being for a quote-unquote resistance to Zionism in the context of October 7th, yeah, you're defending violence. And anti-Zionism is, in fact, anti-Semitism. David Gutman maybe doesn't believe that. And that's fine if he doesn't believe it, but aren't you supposed to kind of keep that stuff out of a news report? I mean, if you want to do an editorial, go for it. But in this case, I guess he didn't want to. Now, yesterday there was a pro-Israel rally in Seattle. It was at Occidental Square ahead of the Seahawks game. They got together. I was there for at least a little bit of it, and then D'Artagnan was ready to go. And then I scolded him. But I did tell people he's a Zionist. And D'Artagnan wore a sticker signaling the number of hostages, so he got engaged, but at some point he was kind of ready to go. So we went a little bit early, but it ended up including a march to Lumen Field. Here's one local activist, friend of the show, friend of mine, David Solovey.
Their hopes and dreams shattered. They're no longer with us, and that's makes me emotional, actually. I've lost friends, and I think the most disturbing thing is not that they died, but the glee that the perpetrators did it with.
Now, he's speaking to Como there, and Como had a reporter there. I believe there was one more reporter from either the AP or the Seattle Times. I don't recall seeing a Seattle Times article on yesterday's march. It might be up there, but I didn't see it. But there was also a Saturday rally that was anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. It included a Hezbollah flag. That is I thought problematic, but it's Seattle, so Hezbollah flags are going to be flying. Maybe someone took it down eventually. Maybe they got confused. They didn't know what it was. They just saw something with a gun on it and resistance, and they always like the color yellow. They were in a rush out of the house to get to their anti-Semitic rally on Saturday over at Pier 62. Also, D'Artagnan and I went down there for a bit because I wanted to see the new waterfront walkway, which it's fine. It's just a walkway. I learned that D'Artagnan doesn't like to walk on the edge of high sort of railings. He wouldn't go to the top railing at all. He resisted, like he could tell we were high up. We weren't even that high, but he could just tell. And then walking down the stairs and he was just terrified. But then we went to the pier and they were setting up and he growled. I will say he growled at them. I don't know what he was growling at, but it was perfect.
He's well trained.
He was very well trained. Like, that's my Zionist dog right there. He legitimately growled as we were walking by. I have no idea what it was that he saw. Maybe he just sensed because he's a converted Jew. He's from Mexico, so he wasn't born Jewish, but he's now a converted Jew. And we ended up leaving, but someone else was there and they sent me the photos of the Hezbollah flag, which is this. Okay. Now, I definitely saw the Times cover that rally in great detail, even, because there was a little excerpt of it that caught my attention. I posted it on social media if you follow me on X. And they have a tendency over at the Times to quote activists who are professional. And on just a whim, I decided to Google the name of the two names of the people they quote in this. And they were also the subject to an article in the Seattle Times about their activism, although in that case it was about climate change. But they were celebrated, this family, this pair, a daughter and her father, Jamie Margolin and her father Mark, who are Jewish, said they were there to show their support for Palestinian resistance. Okay, so even the Times is framing what's going on as Palestinian resistance. That's the framing of the Seattle Times. They're not quoting resistance. They're using resistance without quotes, which means what?
That's their take on it.
That's their take. That's how they view this. Jamie Morgulin said, it's been demonized as terrorism. Yeah, it's not demonized, but the last part is right. Once history has passed, people like to sympathize or say they would have been in solidarity. But for some reason, for a lot of people, because of Western brainwashing, indigenous people staying on their land is being demonized. Indigenous people staying on their land is how she is, the 17-year-old girl, I think she's maybe 18 now, is how she's framing what, the rapes of Israeli women? Is that what she's talking about?
Maybe it's the beheadings.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, it doesn't make it any better.
No.
Just saying. But that's a kind of a weird way to frame this. Yeah, it's just, and this explains why mostly white people are a part of this silly movement on the left. They view this as another stolen land kind of argument. I mean, these are the losers who will give a land acknowledgement before starting meetings at city councils. No one, by the way, will give up the land that they're on. They'll happily continue to live on stolen Duwamish land, but they won't, move. They stay in their little studio apartments while acknowledging they live in, it's the people who on X in their bios, it says where they live, Duwamish land, stolen land. Like, okay, yeah, we got it. Mark Margolin recalled his own upbringing in a traditional Jewish synagogue, where he said an Israeli flag always hung next to an American flag. I learned a lot this year, he said unironically, because they say he also recalled his visits to Israel and learning about the atrocities of the Holocaust. The same thing is happening in Palestine, he said. The same thing is happening in Palestine, says the guy who's an adult who said he's learned a heck of a lot in the last year. And of course, as a Jew, he already knew about the Holocaust. I'm guessing he did not really know anything about the Holocaust.
It kind of seems that way, yeah.
Yeah, but he's a Jew, so we're supposed to pretend that he's representative of the greater Jewish population. He's not even a reflection of the greater Jewish population in Seattle, okay, where you have to assume we would have a disproportionate number of these lunatics. No. No, I mean, somewhat 96, 97% of the globe's Jews are Zionists. He's very clearly not. And let's be honest, when people talk like this, especially when they use their Judaism in this way to give this movement a little bit of extra cachet, they're ginos. Jews in name only. That's it. These are people who maybe they grew up culturally Jewish, or maybe their parents are Jewish, and so because Judaism is passed on by birth, by blood, so long as your mother is Jewish, his mom was Jewish, and so he just identified as Jewish, but never really was. You know what I mean? That's what we're talking about here. Sorry. I mean, I could call him a zealot, I suppose, but that seems a little extreme.
Kind of like those, Catholics for abortion groups. Like,
Yeah,
okay,
it's
you're
like,
not really
You're not Catholic. It's okay.
Your last name's Kennedy. And
Yeah, it's okay. You're not a Catholic. You don't have to be Catholic, but you're using your family's connection to Catholicism to try to forward a political agenda, which seems kind of just shameful, I think. You think Gino's going to stick around? I don't think so. It sounds dirty almost.
I say it's kind of gross.
I know, it does sound kind of gross.